Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
You're here to have another conversations, and we're deep in the topic of Norse mythology.
Awesome.
Which again is something that you know a little bit about. Almost everyone knows something about Norse mythology, but the original Norse myths are kind of dark and kind of crazy. Before we get too deep into it, I want to talk about Odin. To understand Norse mythology, you have to understand Odin. He's like the heart of it all. He's the leader of the Aesir, the gods of Asgard. He's known as the All-Father since he created life on Earth. Mm-hmm. He has about 200 names. I mean, aside from the ones that he was worshipped under, like Wotan and Wotan and all of those things, he has a lot of names that are technically nicknames. But they reference different aspects of him. And one of the reasons why he has so many different aspects is that he is a very ancient god. Odin was worshipped long before the Viking culture was created. Mm-hmm. He was worshipped all across Northern Europe. Images of mysterious figures with crows on their shoulders and things like that go like way, way back. I mean, anthropologists have no idea how old Odin worship actually is. He has the crows are one of his signature things. He has two of them. They're named Hugin and Munin. When I was a kid, I pronounced them Hugin and Munin. I think I was confusing them with Heckle and Jekyll, who are a totally different set of crows. Hugin and Munin are also known as thought and memory. And they fly around the world learning things, gathering information, and they bring it back and they sit on Odin's shoulders and whisper to him. So that's part of the ways in which he gains knowledge. Knowledge is very important to Odin. Ravens and crows are associated with the dead because they eat carrion. Mm-hmm. So in a battlefield, you'll often find ravens gathered to feast off the dead. Since Odin was a battle god, he's referred to as the feeder of ravens. Mm-hmm. He's also referred to as the Lord of the Dead, because in addition to all of his other responsibilities, he also presides over Valhalla. Now, Valhalla is the famous place that Viking warriors go if they've died a death in battle. It's this gigantic mead hall where you drink all night and eat like roasted ox and everything, and the next morning you grab your sword and you run out and you battle and you fight all day long, and then you come back and your wounds are instantly healed and you grab more mead and more roasted ox, and you do that forever until the end of time. Or technically until Ragnarok, where all that practice you've been getting fighting will actually come to use. Ragnarok being the end of the universe.
Okay.
So at the end of all things, you'll be freed from Valhalla and rush out with all of your hard-earned centuries of battle skills to go fight.
That's what I was missing. So
Yeah.
the dead come back to life in some way?
Technically, yeah.
Okay.
They're a little fuzzy on that.
Cool.
It's a little-known fact that Odin isn't the only Lord of the Dead in Norse mythology. The Valkyries, who are the fabulous like warrior maidens, Valkyrie means choosers of the dead.
Okay.
Since sometimes they're looked at as they're the ones that actually pick who will die before the battle begins.
Before?
So they already know that you're going to bite it.
Well, they know that you are, or you bite it because they decided you were going to?
That depends on how you look at it. The Valkyries sometimes rode winged horses, famously, as in the Wagner opera, and the recent Marvel movie.
Right.
Had a winged horse. Sometimes they have a cloak with raven feathers on them. They can change into ravens. So looking across a field of battle and you see the ravens feasting on the dead bodies, you think, oh, those are Valkyries picking up the souls to carry them off to Valhalla.
Right.
But according to some Norse myths, the Valkyries actually split the dead between Odin and Freya. Exactly. Odin had Valhalla, and Freya, who is mostly the goddess of love, had Volksanger. And Volksanger was her resting place for the dead. It's literally only mentioned in 2 surviving Norse myths, so we know almost nothing about it. Apart from the fact that it wasn't Valhalla and presided over by Freya. There is in one of the Norse myths, a female character who was anticipating her death says to another character, my next meal will be with Freya, indicating she's not long for this world.
So if Valhalla is for those who died an honorable death, is Freya's world for those who did not?
Well, if you had a really dishonorable death, you would go to hell and be tortured by Hela for all eternity.
Oh.
It's possible, and this is a modern assumption that might not be Viking accurate, that Volksanger was for people who had an honorable death but weren't lucky enough to actually die in battle. Technically, you had to die in battle to reach Valhalla. So if you're a noble Viking warrior who is brave and true, but you tripped falling down a flight of stairs and broke your neck, you would wind up in Volksanger, which wasn't a bad place in any way. It wasn't a punishment or anything. It was just much more laid back and casual than Valhalla. In the Magnus Chase series by Rick Riordan, my hero spends a lot of time in Valhalla, but he also gets to visit Volksanger. And Rick Riordan's modern-day interpretation of Volksanger is that it's basically like spring break in Cancun. It's a giant beach party. Everybody's bouncing a beach ball back and forth and listening to mellow music and seeming a little bit stoned. Technically, if you're a Viking, you're supposed to vastly prefer Valhalla over Volksanger. But I have to say, for myself, I'd much rather go with Freya after death.
Okay.
So Volksanger puts a lot less pressure on the dead.
Clearly.
Yeah. But Odin was the Lord of the Dead. He was the feeder of ravens, among his many, many names. He was very obsessed with knowledge. The Vikings didn't have a god of wisdom, per se. But Odin was definitely obsessed with knowing things. He would wander the earth disguised as a mortal. And he always had a gray cloak and a big, floppy hat that came down over his face. If you've seen Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf in the first scenes, Ian McKellen looks to a T exactly the way Odin is described in the Norse myths. Because Tolkien was a real student of Norse mythology and borrowed a lot for his Lord of the Rings theory. And the idea of the man in gray who wanders the earth, a man of power hidden behind a simple cloak, was one of the concepts that fed into the creation of Gandalf.
So that was the extent of the parallelism, or was
Mostly. Gandalf is not Odin.
Okay.
But that image of the guy with the hat coming down over his face who arrives mysteriously and does magical things, that's where we got the idea from. Odin was known as the Wanderer. He was known as the Man in Gray. One of his nicknames, according to a huge list on Wikipedia, is the Hat Wearer. Because apparently his floppy hat was very important to some people. Odin is the Hat Wearer. He's also known as the Riddle Reader and the Lord of Hanged Men. Riddles, because riddles are secrets that give you knowledge once you solve them.
Okay.
So he was the man who solved riddles.
But hanged?
Hanged men, yes. He had an affinity for hanged men. When bodies, after they're hanged, are decaying, ravens will come down and feast on them, of course. And of course, that was really Odin's people at work. Some say he would approach a body as it was dying to hear if the man could whisper any secrets that gleaned from the land of the dead that Odin would bring back to the world of the living.
You know what comes to mind?
What?
Have you been to the mall where there's this massive, just round piece of beef rotating?
Yeah.
And they just... Okay.
Yeah. Well, Odin had an affinity for hanged men because he was one himself.
Oh.
Yes. One of his big myths, he hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree. He hung from a branch of Yggdrasil for 9 days.
Wait, so he wasn't always immortal? He started human?
Well, no. He was immortal, but he still hanged himself for 9 days. It just didn't really kill him. Remember when I was saying to be a shaman for the Eskimos, you had to have a after-death experience? And that gave you powers to talk to spirits. Well, Odin was hanged by the neck for 9 days and awakened from it with the power to read runes. He could read magical writing after that.
Okay.
So in a sense, he died and came back to life with extra powers. He went up a level.
But he hung himself intentionally for that purpose.
Intentionally. He sacrificed, the one phrase from one of the Eddas is, he sacrificed himself to himself.
Was it really a sacrifice?
Well, that's a debatable thing when someone has that happen. He did it deliberately to get powers that he didn't have before.
What did he lose?
I don't know. He hung there for 9 days and it was really painful and uncomfortable.
Well.
Yeah.
if I want to get muscles,
Well,
it's going to
yeah.
be painful and uncomfortable.
It was very, yeah. When Roy Thomas was writing Thor, he did a flashback to having the comic book Odin do this. And because Roy Thomas, the scholar that he is, instead of having him actually hung by the neck, which actually probably the comics code at the time wouldn't have allowed, he actually has him literally crucified on the branch in a very Jesus Christ style.
Oh.
Making a deliberate parallel between Odin's hanging and the crucifixion of Christ.
It did catch my attention that he went by so many names,
Yeah.
because I was thinking, oh, you know, Jesus does as well, or God,
Mm-hmm.
the Christian God does as well. So that was...
Yeah. Roy Thomas made the implicit very explicit. We know that all these Norse myths were written down after Christianity had reached the Vikings, although they're much, much older than that. So it's possible they've been tainted by Christianity, but we don't really know for sure.
I was going to say, to what end? What was he trying to suggest or state?
Again, the parallel between the crucifixion and Odin hanging himself. Both of them emerged on the other side in a way more powerful.
Ah.
But of course, technically, so did Obi-Wan Kenobi, so I'm not sure if that's a really good metaphor.
Okay.
But at the time Roy Thomas wrote that story, I was like 12 when I read it. I thought it was absolutely mind-blowing.
Lots of food for thought there.
Yeah, Odin always craved wisdom, no matter what it cost him. At that time, the wisest person in the 9 worlds was a guy known as Mimir. And Mimir sat at the foot of the Yggdrasil, the world tree, and he had this well there. And drinking from the well would give you infinite wisdom. So naturally, Odin had to have it. Now, for reasons that don't fully make sense to us in the modern world, he went there and he had to ask Mimir for a drink of water, and Mimir denied him. Despite the fact they were actually cousins, they related to each other. And so Odin recites, but your mother was my mother's sister, and so forth and so on. It doesn't work. Mimir still says no until finally Odin says, what must I sacrifice? And Mimir says, it will cost you an eye. Oh, sorry, trigger warning, I should have said that. Yeah. So Odin removes one of his own eyes to give to Mimir.
I feel like in childhood, maybe Odin got the bigger piece of cake, or
Yeah.
there's a grudge there.
I don't know. Anyway, he loses an eye doing that, which is why he's also Odin the One-Eyed. Mm-hmm. And when he has his big floppy hat that he's wearing, it's sometimes pulled down over the empty eye socket.
Okay. Was there a significance to the eye? If he could have told him to sacrifice anything,
Yeah.
why the eye?
I'm not sure. Symbolically, actually, Neil Gaiman literally says, after drinking from the well, he gains suddenly all this knowledge. And Neil Gaiman says he could see far better with one eye than he ever saw with two.
Okay.
So again, I think it's the sacrifice that he has to go through. He loses an eye and it never heals or grows back, even though he's Odin the All-Father. He's always without an eye. It's almost always the left eye that he loses. I'm not sure if that's significant or not. And what he gained from that was a knowledge of Ragnarok.
Oh.
He saw into the future and saw that Ragnarok was coming, and he saw the details of how it would occur. And that made him twice as obsessed with becoming more powerful and learning more secrets. When I use Odin in role-playing games sometimes as a character, he's often obsessed with stealing magical weapons from other pantheons or getting heroes on his side to do things. In the Iron Druid series of paperback books, the hero has a successful foray into Asgard, where he winds up killing several Norse gods, but ultimately Odin puts his foot down and says that he has to take the place of those gods in Ragnarok. So the final book in the Iron Druid series is where he's finally called to task for all of his numerous crimes and has to actually stand with the Norse gods against, the giants who will overwhelm the earth. So what kind of things was Odin willing to do? Well, he hung himself from Yggdrasil. He lost his own eye to gain power, but that wasn't all. There was more than that, of course, because, he's Odin. Now, there are 9 worlds, and each world has its own people living on it. So in Vanaheim lived the Vanir. And the Vanir were also a race of gods. One person on YouTube describes the Vanir as like the Aesir but prettier. They were fertility gods, and they were associated with the earth and growing things and stuff like that. It is very, very likely the Vanir were worshipped by a group of people that the Vikings obliterated.
So these are fictional worlds, or are they meant to resemble like our continents?
I think of them as dimensions, kind of. The Vanir were the gods of their world.
Okay.
And the Aesir were the gods of their own world, in a sense. And our world, Midgard, was only one of the 9 realms.
Okay.
Just another branch of Yggdrasil. Now, in Asgard, the gods are always like feasting and throwing parties and things like that. They did that a lot. And one time an old woman showed up named Heger or something like that. It means golden. And she was a soothsayer. And she demonstrated a lot of magical abilities for the gods. And they became very obsessed with getting her to do things for them. And they wound up fighting over what to do with the spells that she had.
Why are spells and magical abilities seemingly foreign to gods?
Apparently these gods can't naturally cast spells.
Does that occur frequently?
The gods have powers, but they can't cast spells. This woman was skilled in things that the Norse gods had never seen before.
Okay.
And their obsession with her and her abilities caused them to become angry. So instead of blaming themselves, they blamed her for causing dissension amongst themselves. And so they wound up skewing her with spears and tossing her into a fire.
Sounds about right.
And then what should happen when she comes out of the fire? And so they think, okay, crap, now we're in trouble. So they stab her again, throw her to the fire a second time, not learning their lesson. The Norse gods are not necessarily the brightest of gods.
Clearly.
They wind up going through this routine 3 times. So she is stabbed and burned 3 times before she finally sheds her disguise and reveals herself as Freya, one of the most beautiful and powerful of the Vanir.
Okay.
She's really Freya from Vanaheim. And now they've insulted her so horribly. I mean, you kill someone 3 times. There's kind of no getting around that or explaining it away. Once, maybe an accident. But 3 times they killed her? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So this is going to be war between our peoples. And so she went back and she tells her brother Frey and Njord, who's one of the leaders of the Vanir, and they marched their army against Valhalla, against Asgard, and huge war erupts, and the war goes back and forth for a long time, tremendous damage to both realms. They finally realize that neither side can ever really win. They can just destroy each other. So rather than have mutually assured destruction, actually one person described it as the Vanir were better with magic, but the Aesir were much better with physical weapons. So it's literally, if you can imagine in Dungeons and Dragons terms, a battle between like swords versus sorcery, with the Vanir erecting like spells and sending off mystical blasts at them, while the Asgardians beat down their defenses with huge axes and swords and things like that.
Now, was there a portal to go from one dimension to the other?
Well, the Asgardians had Bifrost, which was a rainbow that you could travel on. Bifrost was the rainbow
like the
bridge.
Care Bears? Like the Care Bears?
Just like the Care Bears, absolutely. So they traveled on their rainbow bridge, Bifrost, which according to the first Thor film, not only teleports, it was also some kind of a death beam. But
wait, does this mean that the Care Bears actually come from Norse mythology?
I don't think so. But the idea of the rainbow being a gateway from one place to another is a folkloric concept. I have a personal theory about that. This is a theory I have yet to find verified by any expert, but I feel really certain it's true. Bifrost is always described as a rainbow bridge, because it's a band of many colors stretching across the sky. I don't think it's a rainbow at all. I think it's the Northern Lights. because where the Vikings lived, they could see the northern lights all the time.
Right.
And they're so far north, it would literally appear to be a band of color stretching across the sky.
Yeah.
Plus, it crackles and looks kind of bizarre and magical in a way that rainbows mostly just sit there and look pretty.
It does look magical.
Yeah.
That's really
I
cool.
think Bifrost was really the northern lights that they were traveling on.
Wow.
So definitely that helped the Asgardians, but it wasn't enough to keep the fight from ending in a draw. So they decided that they would drop a peace treaty, and they would exchange hostages, basically. So the Asgardians sent a couple of their people. They sent Mimir, the smart guy, and a guy named Hodor, who was really handsome. He was tall and handsome. Long-legged Hodor, he's described in the Eddas. That was a big thing for them, I guess. And so the Vanir, for their part, sent Frey and Freya to live with the Asgardians. And so Frey and Freya both became adopted into the Asgardian pantheons, and they're always referred to as members of the Aesir, even though technically they're Vanir.
Okay.
Now, in some versions of the story, Odin is always described as being married to Frigga, who is a goddess of marriage and running your house and things like that. Frigga is a very dull character who doesn't really do very much in any of the myths. There are other myths that Odin is actually married to Freya. And some people say that Frigga and Freya are really the same goddess, just with different names, much like Odin has 200 names.
Well,
yeah.
She's at work monitoring, so not hell, just the lesser.
Yeah.
Right? And so by the time she gets home, she's exhausted.
Well, Freya was the goddess of love. She was described in one of the Eddas as the goddess of all things men desire. She was literally physical lust in human form.
She's very tired.
Yeah. And she had a thing about gold, too, which we'll cover later. She was gorgeous. She was beauty personified. And since she was already the soothsayer who had caused such dissension among them when she arrived in disguise, she obviously was the queen of all kinds of magic the Asgardians didn't have.
Right.
So she taught her magic to Odin.
Oh.
Remember I said once that they consider using magic to be unmanly, and that Odin was looked down upon because of the spells that he cast?
Yes.
That's because he learned his spells from a woman.
Ah.
Freya taught him all of her secrets. Her magic was called Sedar or Sadiar. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I found 6 different spellings online.
Wow.
Basically, it means woman's magic. Some people say it's for telling the future. I found one account that said it was shape-shifting, that she allowed Odin to change into any form. There's also a possibility that Sadiar refers to fate and destiny, and that he wanted that power so he could unweave the destiny that would destroy the Aesir. However, when you stop and think about it, and I did while I was preparing for this, Odin, who will do anything to get more powerful and wiser. Now, a war erupts between them and another bunch of gods. Huge loss of life. At the end of the war, 2 members of the Vanir are press-ganged into joining the Asgardians, one of whom Odin marries, who then teaches him magic. Wow, didn't that work out really well for Odin? Did he actually trigger a war with Vanaheim just to nail Freya?
Wow.
And get her powers? It would be a colossal jerk move, but it's exactly the kind of thing that Odin would deliberately manipulate.
I can see that being the case.
Yeah. That's Odin in action. It's... as one anthropologist said, the Vikings worshipped their gods, but didn't always like them that much.
But so the intent, if I understood it, was that he could prevent Ragnarok?
He wanted to prevent Ragnarok, the destruction of the universe.
Which did not ultimately happen, correct? I mean,
well, technically, it's going to ultimately happen, no matter what he does, in almost every interpretation of it. The question of whether you can really defeat destiny is the ultimate riddle that every Norse god faced.
So this remains to be open-ended as actual life as we know it hasn't ended yet. There's no end story?
So far as we know, yes.
Within the myth, there's no
There is no end point of the myth. They don't go past that. Technically, they stopped worshiping the Norse gods and Vikings became Christianized before the end of the world came.
Okay.
Which would leave them totally unready if it actually occurs.
So for all we know, he may have been successful.
He might have been successful. in the comic books, they have the comic book version of Odin pulling all kinds of stunts, like taking a mortal and giving him Thor's powers, and Thor was like, "What happened to my powers?" And it turns out he was going to send out another guy and call him Thor. By taking this one person and pretending that he was Thor, sending him a situation where he was bound to die, he could actually prevent Thor from dying in Ragnarok.
Now, have I just entirely missed it, or what actually causes Ragnarok? Like,
there's a series of events which I will get to when we get there.
Okay.
Series of things that have to happen for Ragnarok to occur.
Oh.
Even though there are some obvious things Odin can do to head it off, there are also things that he refuses to do for varying reasons. So basically, Odin is what the Vikings had for their All-Father, the leader of all of their gods.
So meatloaf, I won't do that.
Yeah.
Some things you just won't do.
Yeah, in the comic books, Odin is always drawn as being this big guy with like flowing gray hair and huge shoulders, like a over-the-hill football player. Anthony Hopkins played him in the movies.
Right.
In most of the myths, he's described as being lean and hungry, like a wolf.
Okay.
The much more thin, Ian McClellan as Gandalf was a much better version of Odin, technically, than Hopkins was, from the mythology anyway. Again, Norse mythology, very different from the comic books and movies.
Right.
So basically, he would spend his time wandering the earth. And so if a stranger showed up at your door, a mysterious traveler shows up at your door, you should bring him in and show him every hospitality, because he could be Odin in disguise. Now, that's a motif we saw back when I was talking about folklore. The mysterious stranger who shows up that you should be polite to is a way of informing people you should always be polite to someone who comes to your door who doesn't have a bed or a meal. In Norse mythology, it's because it could be Odin. But we see that motif in fairy tales and folklore again and again, where someone turns aside a wanderer and it winds up being someone powerful who punishes them.
I'll stick by being cautious.
I know, yes. In this day and age, we're taught to be cautious, but in those days, it was different. Once you have Odin under your roof, though, if you've got something valuable in your house or powerful, and Odin wants it, he's going to get it. You may think you can outfight him, but you will be wrong. You may think you can outwit him, but you will be mistaken. Odin will outwit you in the end.
But we should invite him in.
Yes.
Solid plan.
A long time ago in a role-playing game I played with my friends, they found some dwarves who'd been tricked by Odin into making an enormous amount of stuff that he wasn't going to pay for. And at one point, my wife exclaimed, "Didn't you know that was Odin in disguise?" And I didn't know what to say for a second, so I had the lead dwarf scratch his bearded chin and say, "Yeah, but it's one of those things you have to do."
Apparently so. I'm not sure I would have thrived well.
Yeah, Vikings, it was a tough life. They had tough, rangy, desperate gods.
I should think so.
All right, so we'll move on to more popular gods like Thor and Loki next week.
All right.
All right, so until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
I'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.